Professor Brummer, welcome to Meridian.
Thank you so much. It's great to be here.
Yes. I'm the Chief Legal and Policy Officer, for those of you who have not met me before, and Chris is a professor at Georgetown. And because this is your first Meridian, I like to welcome people into the stellar ecosystem by asking to share a fun fact.
A fun fact. I have to dig deep, but there's absolutely no merit or anything about this. But I was an exchange student when I was just 16 years old. I'm from Arkansas, so for those of you who do not know where that is, it's sort of around Texas. And when I was in Germany for the year, the way that I learned was, in addition to going to school, bartending. Because I felt that if you could understand German under those circumstances, you could really speak German well.
All right.
And that's my.
All right.
Now, hopefully,
How
I don't
is your
speak that
German?
way. I would like to think it's pretty good, but people kind of chuckle when they hear it. Maybe that's why.
Well, that makes it a more fun fact.
Yeah, exactly.
So, when I was in law school, the professors.
This is much less fun. Back.
My law school days were awesome.
Oh, were they? Okay.
Yeah. But the professors tended to be very much like in their ivory towers, and they were thinking a lot and writing and publishing and getting us to do all their work for them. But you seem to have taken a very different approach to that. So can you just talk a little bit about, how you've approached being a professor and becoming an expert?
Well, it's really interesting because 2 of the 3 courses I teach did not exist when I was in law school. And, I teach securities law, which is in the United States, basically capital markets, issues of disclosure, issues relating to sort of, how does one raise capital in capital markets. But the other 2 courses, there's one called Decentralization, Finance, and the Law, which is as much as sort of a philosophical and even economic course that's not only centered on digital assets, but also asking, we literally start with Hayek and then we kind of move through courses. So kind of ivory tower, but also we have almost every week someone from either the AI or the crypto or some sort of community expert to demonstrate to us some new piece of technology. And then this another course that I teach is called, basically it's international financial regulation. And that was a course that also did not exist when I was in law school. No one cared about things like the G20 or the Financial Stability Board or the Basel Committee when I was in law school. And to sort of walk students through what that international regulatory architecture looks like is now relevant. It was relevant, it's been relevant now for about 15 years, but it's also continues to be relevant even in conversations relating to blockchain-based services and industries.
All right. And every time I communicate with you, you are in another country or just coming back. So I don't know exactly how you keep your classes running, but that's another part of your approach to becoming an expert and being a professor is really more engagement.
So, I think that there's no way to be an expert in something that is as quickly evolving as cryptocurrency, and frankly, any kind of emerging technology, unless you're kind of out there. You cannot learn it just from books, because most of them haven't been written, and you reach a certain age where you realize, man, I've written a lot of the books about XYZ, and I'm like, can I really trust that guy? And I think that if you're not talking to the real experts, people who are on the ground, you're never going to be able to write something that's really going to change the conversation. So I talk to people pretty much every day. In the regulatory community, I live in Washington, D.C., so just like London, as you know, it's a small town. It's very easy to know people who are making important decisions, and sometimes they come over to your office and they ask you questions. And at the same time, just talking to the people, the entrepreneurs, the builders, it's essential in order to get, if at a minimum, to ask the right questions, much less to get the right answers.
Yeah, I think we very much believe at the foundation in that public-private dialogue, and you have played such an important part in bringing that together. And I think that there's a really important piece of it's not just a conversation, it's really an engagement and learning back and forth. So
I always tell people, even when I testify on the Hill, nobody has a monopoly on good or bad ideas. I mean, it's just impossible. I mean, literally what we do is very interdisciplinary. It's extraordinarily helpful to talk to economists. It's essential to talk to the engineers. If you're not talking to the lawyers every once in a while, you're probably going to find yourself in some trouble. If you're not...
Did everyone at the foundation hear that? You got to talk to the lawyers once in a while. No.
She's very important. She is very important. I mean, you can either learn that early or you find it out belatedly, and it's a little bit more painful. But if you don't have the conversations with very different people who are very expert and engaged, you're never going to be able to sort of build successfully and in a sustainable way.
Yeah. And obviously, I think at this point in the trajectory of blockchain and crypto, there is a consensus that there need to be regulations. There's a lot of calls for regulatory clarity. I believe, and I'm curious what your thoughts are, is that blockchain can actually be part of that solution, as opposed to just going to the regulators saying, tell us what the regulation should be. What do you think about the technology itself being part of simplifying and being the solution itself?
Yeah, I mean, technology conversations in Washington can sometimes be a little bit difficult. Like most policy, solutions are sometimes born of crisis, and people don't really look at something until there's a problem. But when you just sort of think about a blockchain and you think about what a distributed database is, and you think about the core features of immutability and transparency, well, it doesn't take very long if you're a nerdy law professor to sort of think, hey, man, there's some pretty cool applications that you can use to solve any range of challenges that regulators are always faced with. And looking creatively at the technology as a platform for both sort of building things in terms of market infrastructure, but also thinking about what kind of new regulatory infrastructure you can build with a blockchain is super exciting and super interesting, and it's something that regulators in many parts of the world are grappling with, and that's just going to accelerate. Obviously, in the United States, it'll accelerate because of political changes, but certainly around the world. I talk to central bankers like you almost every day, securities regulators and the like, and everyone is actively thinking through how can they deploy those technologies. I find it really interesting because you can ask, how do those technologies help to speak to making crypto safer or easier, or encouraging liquidity in the market or whatever? But I also very much like to ask, how can even TradFi be upgraded using blockchains and blockchain-based infrastructures?
Yeah, definitely has to work together. So let's talk about one particular regime, which is in the EU. They passed MiCA. Very clear framework, here are the rules, this is what industry needs to do, just go do it, right? No gaps.
I was like, I think that MiCA is a glass half full. There's a lot of really important details. It spells out a regulatory regime for crypto assets, for crypto asset services providers, but there are lots of questions as well. Now, the advantage, coming from an American perspective, is we don't have a glass at all. Instead, we're sort of using our hands, which isn't very, very helpful. But Mika, it's not unusual. There will be a Mika 2, I'm sure, and there will be a Mika 3, just as with MiFID and other kinds of regulatory regimes, as people refine and speak to some of those gaps that they're encountering. But I do think that the glass half full is not entirely a bad thing. I mean, it certainly creates some uncertainty, and uncertainty is uncomfortable, but it does also open a space for the engineers and the lawyers to sort of lean in a little bit. When you think about the history of financial regulation, whether or not you're thinking about ISDA, when it comes to the derivative space, when you think about IFRS, or when it comes to accounting, you've always seen the private sector and engaged sort of nonprofit folks very active in standard setting. And once you sort of get your bearings straight with what the rules look like, it does provide an opportunity to refine things, and then a kind of reiterative, to get back to your observation, a kind of reiterative interaction between the regulators and those folks who are filling those gaps.
Yes, and I understand that you have an initiative that is doing
Gap
just
filling.
that, filling some gaps. So can you tell us a little bit about Blueprint?
Yeah, I mean, to what I said, yeah, I really found sort of blockchain-based technology super interesting. I'm in Washington. I've aided all kinds of regulators all around the world, and I've written extensively about disclosures in general. I'm a securities law professor, which means we write about what it means to disclose information to different kinds of regulatory authorities. And I asked the question, and I looked and I said, hey, this is some pretty interesting stuff. Why can't we build solutions using blockchains to both source and verify and deliver information, particularly for participants who are active on blockchains? And I wrote a couple of papers for Stanford and all these different kinds of folks. And there was some movement, but I didn't think it was fast enough. And I didn't think that the opportunity was one to be missed. And when Mika came around with this glass half full, there is a disclosure regime for Mika, which requires issuers of crypto assets to provide certain kinds of information about their crypto assets, about the underlying technology. And for those of you who are from the United States, I thought a lot about how can we make that process as efficient as possible. Disclosure usually requires it can be daunting, particularly for first-time issuers. It can be expensive to the extent to which you rely on legal counsel, and applying it to a crypto asset space is one where you have to think it through a little bit. So we developed a platform called Blueprint that enables in Mika issuers to very quickly create the white papers, which are the disclosure mechanisms under Mika, and to drive down the cost. So it basically automates white papers. If you're from the United States, it's like turbo-taxing your white papers, where you can ingest the data that's given by issuers, and then we went through a series of tabletop exercises with lawyers, experts, regulators, and the like, to kind of think through what are the gaps. I could go through any number of different kinds of examples, but when you think about what needs to be disclosed in any kind of capital market, you have to think about what would a holder of that asset, a reasonable investor, find to be important. And those series of questions are very different from sort of TradFi traditional questions. So in the United States, there are certain kinds of documents where you have to talk about 3 years worth of audited financial statements. It's probably not the best metric in crypto. Instead, you have to ask questions about tokenomics. As important as corporate governance is, blockchain governance is really important. So how can we both lean in, and we've been very sort of active. We just provided a taxonomy to ESMA on how do you make white papers machine readable, to the actual substance. When you're talking about different kinds of features, what do they mean? How do you give life and meat on the bones to those things? And then obviously to create a technology stack where you can drive down those costs and make it fast and easy for folks. And that basic sort of tinkering, it's really cool because I have like engineers on my team and lawyers, and then we have like a lawyer engineer, which is unusual to say the very least, to be able to kind of think through those problems every day and then think, well, what can we do more? How can we then move to crypto native solutions? When you think about real world asset tokenization and the like, what are the kinds of frictions that arise on a regulatory basis in disclosure? How can you speak to them? How can you solve them? And so it's been a delight to work with Stellar and to sort of think through those challenges. It's always kind of cool because you start to talk to folks and they're like, well, just disclosure, and then after a little while they'll see things pop up in different regulatory regimes, whether or not it be Singapore with their attestations with stable coins, or whether or not it be MiCA, and they're like, oh wow, this stuff really exists. I'm like, it does exist. It is key to capital markets, and it's going to be increasingly relevant to anyone who builds on blockchains.
Yeah. So just in case everyone isn't quite as living and breathing this every day, I just want to kind of drill down on this process that you're going through. I think a lot of us would think, well, there's this regulation. They tell us what to do. But what you just described in terms of figuring out what does disclosure mean, can you talk a little bit more about kind of that glass half full and what those gaps are, kind of how now you have a company and a business doing this. How are you working with the regulators to make sure that when you're building, it's TurboTax, IRS has been pretty clear, like this is how you do your taxes. So tell us a little bit more about the process and how you're being received by those regulators.
Yeah, it's and you also asked an extraordinarily, I love the comment, like, what does disclosure mean? So I should even just start there, first of all. So when you think about what disclosure means, and I don't want to be too much like Jay-Z, but there's like a little bit of a triangle here, where at the very, very top of the triangle, you have like your AML KYC. So when you think about the Stellar Compliance Protocol or the initial efforts to really build at the protocol level compliance features, AML KYC is sort of the tip of the spear as to where regulation comes. The rest of the triangle can be thought of as divided between operational requirements, like capital requirements and disclosure. Now, the way in which disclosure is generally thought of is before I take my company public, if I'm Mark Zuckerberg and I want to, go and take Facebook public or something, I have to fill out a certain kind of document called an S1. Traditionally, it's pieces of paper that I fill out, and then I mail them off, and people kind of look at what those disclosures are, and they learn more about my company. When you're talking about, implicitly or inherently digital assets, it offers an opportunity to rethink, well, what does disclosure mean as a digital good, and also can disclosure be something that you build on top of? In other words, can it be part of the delivery process for financial services? So it really opens up the aperture for rethinking it. Getting that done and operationalizing it means, on the one hand, getting a great team together, but you have to constantly engage regulators, in part to bring them along, and frankly, many of the regulators are understaffed, they are under-resourced, and they're given certain kinds of mandates, and what we've done is, and even prior to creating Blueprint, we had a tabletop exercise. We did a pilot with the Bank of Lithuania. We've, as I said, developed our own standards and delivered them to the European regulators for review. But even our informal exercises, which are pretty funny, you get all kinds of exchanges loading on, and people from the Basel Committee. We've had regulators from Switzerland, just literally dialing in to listen to, our experts sort of, in a very law professory way, kind of say, oh, so what does this mean? And then, as I said, you can go through everything from, for the lawyers to make you not fall asleep, like a conflict of interest. Are we talking about MiFID definition of a conflict of interest? Is this a US term? Is this a new term that's developed for MiCA? Like, qu'est-ce que c'est? Like, what does it mean? What does it mean when you're talking, when you think about material information, information that's important? In the paper world, it's something that's hidden, something that you can't find, some information that the creator of something has and the rest of the world doesn't have. Well, what does that mean in a blockchain where code is already available publicly? Like, what does sophistication mean when it comes to crypto assets? Sometimes, a 17-year-old engineer is going to be more sophisticated when it comes to crypto assets in terms of the design and their risks than, Nobel Prize-winning economists. Right? So sort of thinking about what the legal concepts mean and what the expectations are it actually requires a little bit of time and thought, and you kind of have to talk to the regulator, even in a space where this one, we're not directly regulated, even though we're dealing with people who are, right? So it's a very interesting kind of a space. We're not in a position where you necessarily have to ask for permission to do something. But I would say that our business is as engaged or more engaged than almost anyone. Force of habit, being a law professor, but it's extremely helpful because when you get them to come along, it really does instill, I think, a lot of trust, and they know that you're frankly making their life a lot easier as you're making industry's life easier. So engagement is important, and doing it the right way is essential.
This sounds like a lot of work.
It
a
is.
lot of back and forth, a lot of tabletops, a lot of pulling in lots of different stakeholders, and it's all being driven at this point by MiCA.
Yes.
So you travel and talk to regulators in all regions of the globe, I know, because whenever
Yes.
I reach out to you, so are we just setting ourselves up for fragmentation, and every different regime is going to have a new blueprint and a new disclosure iterative process? What do you see, and how are those conversations going with other jurisdictions that may be a little bit like either no glass or a very small drip of water in that glass compared to MiCA?
So I'm old enough to actually, I worked in London in my initial years of being a lawyer, and I'm old enough to actually remember something called the EU Prospectus Directive, which is another kind of paper-based regime, and there was some fragmentation. What we want to do is to be able to take your disclosures and frankly translate them into this basically a compliant form anywhere in the world. But beyond blueprint, when you think about just the substance of the rules, yes, you can think just when it comes to stablecoins, you're going to have differences in terms of permissibility, in terms of whether or not you're complying with the specific regime. What kinds of assets are going to be permissible, whether or not you can have an interest-bearing stable. And I'm just sticking within just stable coins right now. And then what are the disclosure requirements in terms of the stablecoin holder rights? You can imagine any kind of variation that are going to arise, and you will have fragmentation. But what Europe has done by being the first is that they are a model that everyone is going to respond to, right? And it gives them a lot of leadership in terms of steering that conversation. So while there will be fragmentation, everyone is going to be at least sort of looking at MiCA and saying, well, what are they doing? What do I like? What do I not like? But that's the initial starting point, and that's why you hear so much about it, because core concepts are going to be exported.
Yeah. All right, well, we're rules people as lawyers, so I'm going to wrap this up. But I think
Yeah,
from
sorry
my
about all
big takeaway here is that people like you and Blueprint and the industry as a whole, blockchain is global, so we have a very, very important role in making sure that we don't have as much fragmentation as I see the potential.
Well, and again, blockchains actually have, through the automation, through the programmability, even where you do have fragmentation, there is an enormous set of opportunity to drive efficiencies even where you have fragmentation. And I find that super exciting.
Yes. Well, thank you for all the work you do on behalf of the whole blockchain industry, and thank you for being here.
Thank you. It's a great pleasure.
And I'm going to pass it back to Garant.